Canada was one of the last great frontiers of the Western world. In the late 15th century, European explorers set off on adventures of discovery that eventually led to the development of North America as we know it today. Canada is home to millions of people with ancestral roots from every country in the world. Our cities are rich with diversity reflected in the arts, culture, food, and political thought. From coast to coast to coast, our natural resources are among the planet's most rich. We have vast minerals, water, food, oil, and forests. Canada was then, and is now, the greatest geological location on the planet. European settlers date back approximately 500 years, but human existence in Canada has traced to well over 10,000 years ago. Some say 30,000 years ago. Regardless, there is no debate on who was here first. The reality, however, is that there are 1 million Indigenous people in a society with over 30 million Canadians or non-Aboriginals. Two peoples, two histories, one society and one economy. We must live and work together. Our guest speaker will be speaking to us about the importance of increasing Aboriginal people in our workforce. The Honourable Bernard Valcourt is back at our podium, and he was here 21 years ago. He was here then as the Minister of Employment and Immigration. Minister Valcourt has spent the last 30 years in public life and practicing law when the electorate asked him to not be in politics. Serving his constituents in, David Peterson knows that story too. Serving his constituents in New Brunswick and all Canadians in the House of Commons. He has held several cabinet posts, including Minister of Immigration, Labour, and Fisheries and Oceans. Prime Minister Harper recently appointed him as Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development. In the past year, Minister Valcourt has been particularly instrumental in developing relationships with Indigenous people across the country. He is a champion of promoting Aboriginal participation in all matters of Canadian life, including promoting the inclusion of our First Nations people in the Canadian workforce. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Honourable Bernard Valcourt, Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development.
Well, thank you very much, Noble, pour cette introduction des plus flatteuses. Quelqu'un qui retourne 21 ans en arrière pour souligner que j'étais là avec vous. You know, it's quite telling. You know, 21 years ago. You know, and I will honestly admit that it is a privilege to be with all of you here today, and I thank you for your presence. It's a pleasure indeed to be here, but I will tell you off the cuff that this is sombered a bit by, as you all know, the sudden passing of a great colleague, a sure hand at the tiller as the government had to plow through the recession, a great finance minister, a good friend, Jim Flaherty. Jim's dedication and commitment to our country, to this province, and to his family was truly inspiring. And some of you may have had the privilege of meeting and or knowing him, and I'm sure that you, like I, will have fond memories of the time you spent with him. Jim will be missed, but Canadians of all walks of life benefit and will continue to benefit from his legacy. Jim's footprint on the life of so many Canadians and their families shall endure because so many of his deeds just flowed from the good soul he was. So our most sincere condolences to his families and friends. Well, coming back to Dad said, the Empire Club continues to provide one of Canada's premier forums for discussion of the great questions of the day, and I thank you again for the opportunity to be here today. about a matter of great importance to Canada and all Canadians. And I was here on my birthday in 1993, February 18, as the then Minister of Employment and Immigration. And I'll be honest with you, I look back to my speech, which you keep in your, and so many of the things that we were talking about in those days are still so relevant today, 21 years later. So sometimes you ask yourself, you know, how do government progress that rapidly? So the subject of my remarks today, and I'm going to be careful because, you know, you have some of those speakers, you know, that they go on and on and on and on and on. And so I watch the tables because I was once at such an event and we not here. But, you know, we had the speaker, he was going on, and, you know, I mean, so the buddy beside me, you know, he was right at that table right in front, you know. So he puts his head on the table while the speaker is going on and on and on. So I said, John, come on. He doesn't move, he's head on the table. So I bumped him on the head as hard as I could. He says, hit me harder, I still hear him. So I'll be watching the tables. The subject of my remark, as Noble said, is increasing Aboriginal participation in the workforce. And when I said earlier that I referred to Canadians, when I said Canadians, all Canadians, I mean that is a challenge for all of us. I mean, all of us together, governments, businesses, industry, communities, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, all have a role to play in making sure that the conditions are in place for Aboriginal people to have every opportunity to thrive and establish promising futures for themselves, their children, and their communities. Now, you know, we often hear about those socio-economic indicator gaps in between Aboriginals and non-Aboriginals in Canada. It is a fact. It is there. But make no mistake, I mean, when Aboriginal people have access to the tools that non-Aboriginals have access to and too often take for granted, I'm talking the education, the training, the economic opportunities they need to be a strong presence in the workforce, they step up to the plate, and they do, and all of Canada benefits. And in that outcome, we all have a role to play. As Prime Minister Harper stated at the opening of the historic Crown First Nation gathering in January of 2012, held in Ottawa, to maintain a growing and vibrant economy, Canada will need a skilled and growing labor force in every region, urban, rural, and remote. And natural resource development is perhaps the most outstanding example of where we need the skilled labor that will, among other factors, of course, incent business people to make the actual investment decision for without the skilled workforce they need, those investments will not take place. These investments have got to be executed by people. We need a labor force, skilled labor force. Right now, as we speak, there are hundreds of natural resource projects either underway or planned across Canada over the next 10 years that represent an investment of some $650 billion. And a significant portion of that investment is linked to projects that would be on or near Aboriginal communities, projects that they will rely on meaningful consultation and collaboration with those communities, projects that would benefit from the skilled workforce that these communities can and could offer. Now, you know, I've had the privilege of traveling to many areas of Canada, many parts of our beautiful country. And you know, in the southern part of our country, too many of our neighbors and citizens don't seem to appreciate and know that we have a host of First Nations that live in remote communities. And when we say remote communities, they are communities that cannot be accessed other than by air or during the winter by an ice road. And these communities, Canadians, I don't think all appreciate the challenges that exist in order to get the people living in those communities who are Canadians to get a crack at their participation in our economy. Now, yet natural resource development can turn the high cost of isolation into huge advantage for Aboriginal communities. As a matter of fact, most mines and exploration properties in Canada are located within 200 kilometers of an Aboriginal community. And the Ring of Fire here in Ontario is a case on point. So you all know that hundreds of thousands of Aboriginal youth will enter the workplace over the next 15 years, coinciding with what is projected to be a record-breaking shortage of labor in the resource sector. Just one example of why it is in the interest of you as either successful business people or interested stakeholders, indeed all Canadians, Aboriginals and non-Aboriginals alike, to ensure Aboriginal people have access to the kind of education and training which are essential conditions for individual communities and business to prosper. So how can we move toward that goal most effectively? And that should not be and cannot be, okay, a matter for governments alone. Business and industry know the skills and the knowledge they need in their workforce, and they need to partner with governments at all levels, including academia, including, of course, Aboriginal communities, and also invest of their resources to create the skilled workforce they need. And this goes hand in hand with the role the private sector can and must play in assuming meaningful and productive engagement with Aboriginal people where economic development on or near their traditional territory is proposed. Certainly, as a government, we must provide leadership and in partnership with Aboriginal people, you know, I think, and I can say that we are making significant progress in overcoming challenges and removing some long-standing barriers to success. But in the same breath, you know, I add more needs to be done. And the Prime Minister's historic apology in 2008 to the victims of Canada's residential school system, the apology to the victims, to their families, to their communities, was, I think, a very important step into the rebuilding of relationship between the Crown and First Nation. I was in Edmundston last month where I had the honor of participating in the 7th and final national event held by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Over the past 4 years, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has held hearings in more than 300 communities across Canada. And the strength, the determination, and the resilience shown by thousands of former students and their families in sharing experiences and in talking about the legacy of the Indian residential schools, that's beyond admirable. But from my own point of view, it showed that everything is not lost. What was most encouraging was the recognition by so many of them that while we cannot change the past, we can change the future. And the basis of that future has got to be a respectful relationship on the reconciliation of the rights of Aboriginal Canadians and non-Aboriginal Canadians. And, I've been in this portfolio now for a little over a year, and together we are moving forward on a number of key issues: education, meaningful consultation, the self-sufficiency of Aboriginal communities across the country, and assuring the opportunity for Aboriginal people and communities to participate in and contribute to the growth of the broader economy. And education, of course, is fundamental. We all recite, and we've been for decades talking about the gaps. The average high school graduation level among First Nations youth is about 40%. Too many First Nation students who do graduate often find their academic credits do not satisfy the requirements for post-secondary institutions, skills training, or employment opportunities. And this must and will change. And it will not change by throwing more money, more taxpayer dollars at the problem. It will change through a meaningful reform. And when we talk about education, and you look at all of the reasons, some people talk about the root causes. Well, this is about taking steps to effectively correct the situation and bring about a much higher standard of living for First Nations. And that's why I believe the leadership of First Nations, along with Canada, identified a joint action plan in 2011, reiterated at the Crown First Nation gathering that education was a shared priority of Canada and First Nations. And just a few days ago, I was proud indeed to introduce in the House of Commons historic legislation that will create, for the first time, a strong, accountable education system that will support First Nations work to, yes, incorporate language and culture into their own education programming, but also, for the first time, in 2014, if we get this, these are the only little Canadians, those children on reserve, who don't have a statutory right to education. It doesn't exist. Education on reserve is at the policy mercy of the minister currently. So this will change with the bill. It is important that we move this legislation and that we do it quickly because, as National Chief Atleo said, we cannot abandon another generation to a failing system. And when we talk about the failing system, as acknowledged by the national chief, because and we read in the papers and you hear on the news about, the unilateralism. I mean, there's been a very deep consultation process that was started. I mean, First Nations and Canada and the provinces, and Minister Zimmer, I'm sure, can attest to this. I mean, we've been engaged on the education file for years. We have had reports from the Senate Standing Committee. We have had reports from the Aboriginal Affairs Committee. We have had the Auditor General's report of 2011. We have studies all over the place, but more importantly, back in 1971, the Indian Brotherhood, as it was then known, issued a policy paper asking the government of the day to grant the control of education onto First Nations. And, we talk about the bad numbers of graduation, but we have successes among First Nation. In Nova Scotia, 15 years ago, they created their own school authority, the Mi'kmaq, and the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia, 15 years later, their graduation rate among First Nation people on reserve, it's 90%. And it is not close to, it is more than what non-Aboriginal Nova Scotians graduate. So they were given control, the Mi'kmaq, and they are giving results. And this is what is inspiring this legislation. I've talked about the consultations, we've issued documents, the discussion guide, then a draft bill in the fall, and the chiefs and assembly came together in Gatineau in November, and they said, listen, okay, National Chief, this will not work. Here are 5 conditions for success of education. Here are the 5 conditions which any legislative framework must respect if we are going to successfully provide our children on reserve with a good education system. And the National Chief executed and sent me an open letter, which I received, which I read carefully, and I knew, because I happened to read a bit, this was, all that the 1971 paper was arguing for. And it made sense because this is what we see is happening in successful regions where they have control. So those 5 conditions were incorporated into this draft bill, and we now have in front of the House, I think, a legislative framework, a proposal that meets those 5 conditions identified for success. And it will, I hope it gets the support of all members of Parliament from all sides of the House and in the Senate in order that we can pass this legislation speedily in order to get on to the next phase, which will be another tough one, which will be the development of regulation. That will take time. Again, there we're committed to ensure the full participation of First Nations into that process. And this we are going to do through this joint Council of Education Professionals, which the Prime Minister committed to February 7th when we were in Alberta at the Blood Tribe to announce that we had found a way to move forward together on the Education Act. Now, the other important consideration, of course, which was, and I've heard it all over the country, the unilateral oversight of the federal government, this paternalistic approach of the federal government to always be there to tell First Nation members on reserve what to do, how to do it, and what they can do and what they cannot do, and they don't want to see that into education, of course. Well, to avoid this unilateral oversight of education of children living on reserve, so vehemently decried by First Nation chiefs and council and parents and teachers all over the country on reserve. As I said, the Prime Minister in February committed to this Joint Council of Education Professionals, and it is proposed in the Act. This will not be political, they will be expert on education. I mean, you know, we have no expertise as such at the Department of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development and Education. We don't have an education department like you have at the provincial level. So this joint council, which will be formed half of people nominated by First Nations, half nominated by the federal government, will work as an advisor and a filter. You know, the unilateral gestures or decisions of the that's gone. Every decision of the minister will be and must be inspired by the advice of that joint council, so as to ensure that we do, at the end of the day, always have the First Nations' view and perspective on any decision to be taken. Now, this of course, was always, I mean, what we heard about funding, and you will remember, and those who have followed this, funding was indeed very important, and especially since the cap that was imposed in 1996, where there was a 2% cap on all programs at my department. Well, and we've heard, you know, and we could argue that no, we spend as much as per students, but the fact of the matter is that through our last budget, Economic Action Plan 2014, which our beloved friend Jim Flaherty introduced before leaving us, and which shall be part of his legacy, our government has committed $1.9 billion incremental new funding related to this proposed legislation, the First Nation Control of First Nation Education Act. This includes $500 million to infrastructure fund for schools, $160 million for an implementation fund, because we need a transition to get to the mature system we want to implement with First Nations, and as well $1.25 billion in core funding, which will begin in 2016-17 and will increase annually thereafter according to the 4.5% escalator on the full amount of the funding at that time. Now, this incremental funding of $1.25 billion to the $1.55 we currently spend will allow the stable, sustainable and predictable funding which will provide First Nation children on reserve with an education that is comparable to what non-Aboriginal children get in provincial schools in similar locations and with similar demographic. And what is, again, important to realize is that for the first time, they will get the same level of support which our non-Aboriginal kids get in all provincial systems at the second level and at the third level. Now they will have it. And that, I am sure, will bring about great results. So this is a right investment to do for taxpayers, because it will result, I'm sure, in significant economic benefits down the road. Now, you know, I was here 21 years ago, and I was arguing. We were close to an election. I was soundly defeated a few months later. But we were arguing then for the improvements to the then Unemployment Insurance Act. And, you know, we were championing trying to find and introduce active measures to the Unemployment Insurance Act of the day in order to stop paying people, you know, doing nothing, but rather incent the training of these people so that they can access the jobs that exist. And throughout the country, at the provincial level, you know, 20-some years ago, the active measures were implemented. And us at the federal level, while we spend about $860 million a year on income assistance for First Nations across the country, with a dependency rate on income assistance of about 36–37%, we have not reviewed our income assistance program ever since. So, in Economic Action Plan 2013, we made a commitment to work with willing First Nations to improve the federal on-reserve assistance, income assistance program, reflecting the widespread recognition that this program can provide more than just income support. And today, you know, as we speak, 70 First Nations across Canada are commencing the delivery of enhanced supports and access to personalized skills training for young income assistance clients on reserve. And you know, and this is not a great idea of a great minister or a brilliant government in Ottawa. This is the product of First Nations in the country asking for those kind of measures. As a chief told me, he says, I'm tired of seeing the kids on my reserve retiring at 18. I said, what do you mean? Well, he says, 18 is the age I wish they can get their income assistance. And this has got to stop. I said, Chief, you're right. We're going to change that. And with those willing First Nations, we are doing it, and you should see the results. You know, I'm talking about those 70 First Nations who are commencing the delivery as we speak, but the pilot projects have taken place all across the country, especially in Western Canada, and we are seeing results on reserve. I mean, the rate of dependency is falling. It's falling and falling quickly, but what's more important is that these kids, these young men, these young women are getting the skills they need to get onto the labor market and have a much better living. So, I mean, these are some of the approaches that we are taking to ensure that First Nation people, Aboriginal, get the chance to be a full participant into our economy. The Urban Aboriginal Strategy, another program at the federal level, which we have revamped and streamlined into one program with two components where we will work with the municipalities, the provincial governments, the private sector, the not-for-profit sector, because the friendship centers, and you know, they exist throughout Canada. We have a new delivery mechanism where we will be investing $53 million a year during the next 2 years to work this new approach to helping Aboriginal living in the cities by helping them to eliminate those barriers to access the labor market. This is our priority, and I believe that it is another important step that we are taking to ensure that the Aboriginal community can indeed participate in our economy. Now, listen, no one is sleeping. No head on the table is a good sign. Listen, I'd like to say that there's not a single initiative that can be taken that will solve the whole problem. We have, however, to continue taking important, effective steps along with First Nations to address the problem that we all face. I mean, that is why, our government continue to work in close consultation with First Nations and continues to move forward with key initiatives that enable First Nations to escape the paternalistic scriptures of the Indian Act. I can't wait for the day where we don't need the Indian Act anymore. And for instance, we just gave last week the First Nations Election Act just received royal assent. And this will address long-standing issues with the current electoral system set out under the Indian Act. And that is not imposed. First Nations who choose can elect to go under this First Nations Election Act. And instead of having elections every 2 years, they are in constant political campaign. And if you have a chief and council who really want to implement change and move forward in a positive way, sometimes you have to make tough decisions. But when you have to be re-elected every second year, you don't get the chance to implement what you want to do. So now these chiefs and council, and let me tell you that the vast majority of them, those I meet anyway, are people who mean well. They care for their community, they care for their elders, they care for their children on reserve, and these are the people who need the tools. Well, here's another tool here. Ladies and gentlemen, this new Elections Act will not only extend the term of office for chiefs and councils, it introduces a more robust nomination process. It adds penalties for defined offenses and fraudulent activities, and it enables common election days among several First Nations. So this is another step taken that I believe can be helpful in our quest for the progress we all long for. And, this, may seem innocuous, but for investors, if we think about economic development, and you have to do business with these First Nations, well, if you have this political stability, this certainty about their governance, because you have a council in place, for 4 years, well, that will also help to our quest for creating new wealth and jobs all across Canada. Now, we passed last year the First Nations Financial Transparency Act, which will bring accounting standards for First Nation governments in line with those of other levels of government in Canada, further enhancing the accountability and transparency in governance that citizens deserve and investors also deserve. This is about empowering the members of those First Nations. You have to know what your leadership is doing with your money, with the taxpayers' money. You have the right to know and ensure that their leaders have in place the mechanism to protect their best interest. And I think that this Financial Transparency Act will again prove to be transformational, because those members in those communities will be able to see firsthand what is happening to the resources of their communities. We will, of course, continue to taking concrete steps to move the agenda forward following the signing of, I see President Chartrand with us here today, the signing of the Métis Nation Protocol Agreement. And we will continue to work in partnerships with Métis leaders and organizations to ensure that Métis people across Canada continue to share in the economic development opportunities the country offers. I don't know how many of you know, but Métis entrepreneurship is growing fast across the country. Métis organizations and communities are pursuing economic development initiatives and establishing businesses and business relationship with some major corporations. I think of NT Energy, for example, in Northwest Territories, who have partnered with Métis Energy Company Limited. And of course, that brings me to the North. Developing the North is a fundamental part of our future economic prosperity as a country, and we have already moved forward on key initiatives. Last April 1st, for example, was the effective date of transfer of province-like powers to the government of the Northwest Territories. I know that Premier Peterson had a hand in this, and we finally delivered, and now the people of the Northwest Territories are empowered to deal with their land and resources the way they see fit, to the best advantage of their inhabitants and also of Canada. And we are also making progress on devolving those same powers to Nunavut. So, ladies and gentlemen, I wanted today to try to show the importance of all of us at all levels, private sector, non-public sector, governments, and Aboriginal communities to pull together to address this issue of ensuring that we can provide Aboriginal Canadians with the opportunities to get those skills, to get that education, the post-secondary education also, that they need to become full participant. And I humbly submit to you all that I think that we are on the right track. Thank you all.
Please welcome Ted Griffith, Vice President of the Empire Club, to say the appreciation.
Thank you, Noble, and thank you, Minister, for those fine remarks that have reminded us of the importance of First Nations people in this great country of ours. And I must congratulate you on what I believe is managing the most complicated file in Canada, because it covers not only legal grounds, cultural grounds, historical grounds. We're talking about things such as treaties, which I don't know when the last time Canada actually signed a treaty was, but we're talking about treaties that are 200, 250 years old, and getting us to respect those rights. What you reminded me of most of all in your speech was how much we forget about First Nations people and how we really need to remember more in our daily lives. I was a bit shocked to hear the 1971 story, and 43 years later, that these 5 guidelines are being directed. I don't think any of us would take that positively if it was our children that were not being funded as well and taught as well as the children down the road. Just as a quick poll, how many people here in this room were aware that First Nations children across Canada were funded at a lower level for their education than? Good. And the rest of you that weren't, now you know. And this is something that this government has finally addressed. So on behalf of the Empire Club, its members and guests, I want to thank you for speaking with us today. I have a copy of you of our 100th anniversary book. We're in our 110th year now. This is the book called Who Said That? You're probably in here. I understand that we now have every 21 years you can come back. So we look forward to seeing you perhaps again before that time.
Thank you so much.
The club is very grateful to Castles Brock for sponsoring our event today. We'd like to thank the National Post for being our print media sponsor. Thank you to Van Valkenburg for audiovisual. This meeting will be carried and aired on Rogers TV. We are very grateful for your ongoing support. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, and we have our website, which is empireclub.org, where membership information is available. Thank you all for coming. We look forward to seeing you again soon. This meeting of the Empire Club of Canada is now adjourned.